Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 93 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. Joe Meade is with me. And, Joe, we've got some Big Ten teams in the tournament. We're going to go through where they ended up, the teams that missed out, the teams that got in, and then some Big Ten coaching stuff and maybe some transfer portal stuff, too. Now, if you're looking for matchup base and what we think are going to go into all the regions, we're going to do each region's going to get a separate video, whether it's Mike or Joe. So if you want to go into the matchups, it'll be that video. They'll be coming out sometime in the next couple days before the games. But Joe, a little bit surprising. The Big Ten only got 8 teams in the field. And teams 9 and 10, Indiana and Ohio State, were the second and third teams out. Overall, what were your thoughts?
John, it's kind of shocking. I went back to listen to some of our previous episodes, end of January, into February. You had teams like Nebraska, Ohio State, and obviously those were not necessarily snubs. I don't think many, even in that fan base, are that surprised nor upset. But we had teams like USC kind of on the cusp after a few really good wins. They had a week where they beat one at Illinois, beat Michigan State, who obviously is probably one of the better 2 seeds in the country. So to say the depth of the Big Ten has taken a hit, I think it's a very fair statement, Sean. I think you have really good teams like Purdue, Illinois, Michigan, Maryland, Wisconsin, and I think the tournament kind of showed that like the Big Ten it's not necessarily top heavy, but there's a bunch of good teams. But at the end of the day, Sean, the bottom really blew it. Let's just call it what it is, Sean.
I think the bottom was actually better than we thought. So the bottom middle tier, that 7 through 10 range, I think they suffered big time. We had the likes of Minnesota getting to 7 wins, Nebraska and Iowa winning games. Penn State obviously won at the Kohl Center on the last day. Joe, I think Washington was really the only team this year that couldn't compete. And in this instance, I do think it dragged down. I think had teams 14 through 18 been really awful and maybe 3 or 4 wins max, I think teams 9, 10, and 11 might get in the Big Ten here.
Yeah.
I think that kind of was what happened in the SEC. We had LSU and South Carolina really kind of bottoming out, and that's why they got 14 of their 16 in. But had those teams won some more games, maybe they wouldn't have gotten as many teams, but still, 8 teams in the dance. Nobody ended up particularly close. They're all going to be wearing their home jerseys in game 1. And, Joe, let's start with the first 2, Michigan State in the South on the 2 line. It's exactly what we expected, this number 7 overall seed. And then Wisconsin getting to that last 3 also was pretty expected. No surprises there for those 2 teams.
Not at all, Sean. I think Michigan State probably had the best draw of any 2, to be honest with you. I think a lot of Spartan fans, and let's face it, they played Kansas already this year. Kansas is the 7th seed. Not many teams want to play. Initially that was a BYU, that was an Illinois, and at a time UConn. UConn fizzled out 2-8, and then BYU and Illinois notably have risen all the way up to 6s and 5s. So I think, barring a colossal upset, and I think Tom Izzo probably learned his lesson, if there were any, from that Middle Tennessee debacle 9 years ago. I don't really see Marquette nor New Mexico being much of a threat to Michigan State. Now, of course, this is the month of madness, who truly knows, but Cam Jones is probably the only player that'll give Michigan State fits, and unlike Wisconsin with the John Tonji, who you saw give 2 pretty good matchups against Michigan State. They gave Michigan State 2 pretty good games, one at the Breslin and one in Indy that, of course, Wisconsin ended up winning. The problem is they don't have the depth of scoring outside of that. They don't have a Max Klesmit. They don't have a John Blackwell who can ease the tension. They don't even have a Stephen Crow or Nolan Winter. So do I think that Michigan State should be disappointed if they don't make the Sweet 16? Absolutely.
Yeah. I like the draw for the top 2 teams. I think they're both in good spots to make it to the Sweet 16 in the second weekend. Joe, we had 2 more Big Ten teams on the protected seed line. Maryland, the 4 seed in the West, not entirely surprising there. They've built themselves a very nice resume. And then Purdue ends up holding on to the 4 seed in the Midwest. Michigan, then the 5 seed in the South. Now, Joe, this is just a great example of how little the Big Ten tournament matters. I switched the two teams after they played on Friday night of the Big Ten tournament. But really, the only explanation for this is that the teams were already seeded before then. I thought that there was a chance that that game could matter. I think I didn't have Wisconsin on the 3 line before they beat Michigan State. So clearly, Purdue holds on to a protected seed. Michigan, unfortunately, sort of won the Big Ten tournament for nothing in terms of their NCAA tournament seed. Obviously, with the draw that the Wolverines got, it's it's a tough one to swallow right after winning the Big Ten tournament.
John, I was pretty disgusted with the draw. Not necessarily even the UC San Diego part. We'll preview more like individual matchups as we get into the region videos, and Mike's going to do a few, and he's really good at those as well. I'm more shocked that you had more quad one wins than Wisconsin. You beat them twice. You won the season series with Purdue. Probably not an aggregate because of the 40-point drubbing we had on that night in the middle of January, on that fateful Friday night in the middle of January. Better record than them, better strength of record as well. And you did the comparison, and I think this is good to check in hindsight. Sean did a really good cast, whether you want to listen here or here on any platform. Uh, Probably better on YouTube, to be honest, just see the graphic of comparing Michigan to Purdue. Michigan, besides the net, I thought really outranked them.
Yeah, there wasn't. That was Sunday at noon. There really wasn't a comparison by then.
Yeah, I was shocked by that. Maryland, I don't think Michigan fans should nitpick that. I think Maryland clearly was the better resume along with the Michigan State. But the real insult to injury was Oregon being the 5. I understand their body of work at the beginning of the year was superb, but in conference play, let's just face it, Sean, they really had even worse of a skid than Michigan. And Michigan's skid per se, where they lost 4 of 6, 2 were to the conference champion, who is a 2 seed. One was to Illinois, who's a top 25 team, and the other was to Maryland, who's a borderline top 10 team. So kind of punishing that while also picking up a quad one win at Nebraska, albeit not a tournament team, seems really silly to me. Uh, at the end of the day, if Michigan does lose to UC San Diego, this argument kind of dies because let's face it, Sean, you don't deserve to be in the second weekend if you can't win that game.
And the the non-conference did matter in a lot of spots for Oregon's case and for other teams. Um, and for Oklahoma, for example, they were all the way up at the 9 line. They were 6-12 in the SEC. Um, but I thought that Oregon. I think we said it a couple times, Joe, that they're going to get a better seed than they probably deserve. They were playing good ball coming down the stretch, but they lost a number of home games. I think it ended up being 3 or 4 in the Big Ten. Now they did have quite a few good road wins too, and they did beat Indiana in the Big Ten tournament. So maybe that just kept them there. Illinois at the 6, that was pretty universally agreed upon by the bracketologists. One of the very few. I thought the protected seeds were very much consensus, and then once you get after that, you had some real question marks. And then UCLA got pushed to a 7. Joe, this is kind of a broader question, but the 2 seeds, in my opinion, are going to have much easier matchups in the round of 32 than the 1 seeds. If you look at a couple of different analytical tools, the 8 seeds are kind of all really well ranked. Gonzaga's 8th in the net; they're an 8 seed. You have Louisville, who's the 10th ranked team in the country, is an 8 seed, and then you have sort of these teams that have bobbed back and forth on the 7 and 10 line. So, Joe, I like really all the 2 seeds to get to the Sweet 16. Michigan State specifically, I don't see UCLA getting there. But really that last batch of Big Ten teams, not maybe 1 seed line off than expected, but pretty on par with what the bracketologists thought there.
Yeah, outside of Rick Barnes, I guess, all the Texas people who don't like Rick Barnes from his tenure there and some of the more skeptics around the country and in SEC country will probably call out UCLA over Tennessee as an upset. And it's plausible just because of the play style, but based on watching Tennessee, Sky Ziegler, the way they hit shots, I don't think UCLA can keep up. The one, I guess, 7 just before we move on here that I could see is just a Kansas and Arkansas, just from a pure talent perspective, outscoring a St. John's, but I still don't think that's necessarily that likely.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting. Big Ten matchups. We'll get into in the region videos, and that's a good time, Joe, to remind everybody to sign up for the Sports Daily Bracket Pool. It's on ESPN Tournament Challenge. The link will be in the bio of the Instagram. It'll be in the description here. It's free to play. Winner gets a Sports Daily prize. We've done it over the years. We're hoping to get a ton of entries, and maybe some of these Big Ten teams can go on a run. Certainly, it's lining up for a couple of them. Obviously, we can take a look at the region videos to see who we think will pick up some W's. All right, Joe, the other tournament thing here is what ended up happening to my team. Indiana, in almost every single one of the bracketologists' brackets, they end up missing out. Disappointed. I'm disappointed for sure. I think it might be better in the long term to start this coaching search and transfer portal earlier. The main story was North Carolina getting in, West Virginia getting snubbed, Indiana snubbed too, in my opinion. But what was your whole opinion on what happened on the bubble?
I mean, the UNC thing, you could do all the conspiracies of the world, the AD. I think, truthfully, you should come to that conclusion on your own because I don't
There's
think it.
no other acceptable answer, honestly.
Yeah, and frankly, if you come to a different one, I'm not going to rip you, call you an idiot. I'm just genuinely curious where else you're drawing your conclusions, whether you have some inside information, because Indiana picked up zero bad losses all year. Now, you could talk about the blowouts, margin, yada yada yada, but Sean, four quad one wins, no bad losses, and played a very challenging non-conference schedule. That's something we talked about. Purdue, I guess they won those non-conference games, but they were really rewarded, as
Yep.
was a Wisconsin, as was an Oregon. But how is Indiana punished for that? Now, I guess they didn't win them, but Louisville, Gonzaga, um, even a neutral game against Providence, they ended up not being too good. But you know, those are power teams. They ended up playing in a lot of these MTEs and a lot of these neutral site games, and the fact that um, I'm not saying awarded for that. The fact that that wasn't taken into consideration, I think is pretty inconsistent. And we could spend a whole 2 hours analyzing this just in the Big Ten alone of how non-consistent and non-uniform this was. But I think this is a blatant example of it.
And I did have the order wrong, but if you go back to the bracketology video, I think I was sort of right in how I thought my projection could go wrong. Texas was the wild card in all of this. 7 wins against the field, a significant 12-15 in meaningful games. That is now going to be targeted in the future. You don't have to win a lot of games. You just have to pick up wins against the field. Texas did not schedule well. They were pulled across the line by their SEC, bumping up their strength of schedule. But Joe, I thought West Virginia had to be ranked above Indiana, just because I thought the resumes were very similar. West Virginia's was just slightly better. I actually thought Indiana and San Diego State essentially had the same resume. Now, the committee doesn't. And the other thing, I think Xavier had to be ahead of North Carolina. They both had one quad one win. Xavier slightly better in some other things, a couple more wins against the field. So I think when they made the decision to put North Carolina in, that second to last in spot had to be Xavier, if that makes sense. Just
Yeah.
because, and then you can push the teams that have more quad one wins down. You can push the team with more quad one wins up in Texas, and that's how I think they came to this decision. I 100% believe the selection of North Carolina was not done with the most integrity, and you had to, it was probably either West Virginia and Indiana or Xavier and North Carolina, if that makes sense. And
Yeah, it's a package deal
yeah,
because of
because
how they would explain it.
they ended up being really similar. So the net seemed to matter for Xavier and North Carolina in the 30s rather than West Virginia and Indiana in the 50s. Didn't seem to matter in the rest of the bracket, though, as some of the seed lines come out. Louisville, Gonzaga, like I said, Memphis being in the 50s in the net and on the 5 line. But yeah, I don't think this committee did a very good job. I
No.
ended up with 359 on the bracket matrix, which I don't know where that ends up, honestly, but I think it's all right. Probably, you know, a little bit above average. You'll see the where I stack up in the ranks for. I did tie Joe Lenardi after all the
Really?
after all
We got to
the.
put that on the account,
Well,
Sean.
I was ahead of him over the years, so
Yeah.
he doesn't pull any closer. I keep my lead over him, but yeah, it is going to change some things, Joe. Not only of how bracketologists look at this, but also how athletic directors approach scheduling now. We saw it in football. It's a real big issue. Not issue, but you kind of just need a couple of good teams on the schedule and you need to win some games in football. In basketball, if you're the AD of whatever school, Joe, how are you going to be approaching non conference scheduling going forward, trying to get your team in if they're on the bubble?
I think I call it the rule of four. Now, the Big Ten, you play 10 non-conference games. I think there's probably four you have to schedule, whether that's through an MTE or a neutral site game where, maybe just go one of or two of four there. Because Michigan, notably, I think probably what hurt them was their lack of non-conference wins. They ended up only playing one quad one non-con game, and that was winning one quad one non-con game, and that was a neutral game against Xavier. And they lose to an Oklahoma, lose to an Arkansas, and lose to a Wake Forest, which ended up almost being not so good a loss. So I think, and the future teams, especially if they're more confident in their rosters, are going to look at this and say, even at Oregon, whose record wasn't so sexy, same with Purdue. Um, it didn't end up costing them much. They're a much higher seed than teams with better records and with more quad one wins. So,
Yeah, I think that's the takeaway, Joe. I think my another takeaway is that we like MTEs not controlling who you play. I think ADs are going to try and get away from that. Indiana and West Virginia both went to the battle for Atlantis, didn't control who they played. West Virginia goes 2-1. They beat Gonzaga, and they lose to Louisville or Oklahoma, and then they win in the third place game. And Indiana plays Gonzaga, Louisville, and Providence, 2 8 seeds and a team out. Like, I think going in, both teams expected all three of their opponents to be tournament teams, and at least two of them being pretty good teams. So I think we're going to see a lot more of these fake neutral home and homes in the future. You know, Obviously already on the schedule for Indiana is a trip to Rupp Arena next year, hosting Kansas State. But they're not the best, these neutral games in NBA arenas that are 70% full. But I think that's where we're headed in this, that you can control the opponent that you play. And North Carolina scheduled very well. They didn't win any of the games, but they were given that respect because they kept some of them close and their numbers were good. But I think we're going to see a little bit of a decrease in the MTEs, especially because they have to. If you have an 8-team MTE, you need 8 different conferences. You're going to get some teams in there from the Atlantic 10, Missouri Valley, something like that. So that is my takeaway. I think we're going to see a lot less MTEs.
yeah, Sean, and I think that's a part of what makes Feast Week so interesting is those MTEs. I think um, the committee, the committee clearly doesn't have deals with them based on the way they picked this. So I'll just put it that way. Probably their one bit of nobility that I could give them. At least they're not taking bribes from Maui. It just might be from different countries that may or may not be on our own domestic watch list, but we could stop the politics right at that.
Yeah. So this I think it's going to take at least one, maybe 2 more years for the committee to regain the trust of bracketologists and the public. Um, you know, Bubba Cunningham, North Carolina AD, the chairman of the committee. This is what he's going to be remembered for. Whether that's fair or not, he just hired Bill Belichick to be his football coach, and this is what he's going to be remembered by. It's
Yeah.
unfortunate. Um, he's reportedly receiving a big bonus for getting, or for his team making the tournament, and unfortunately for him, this is going to be a stain on his legacy that I don't think he's ever going to outgrow.
Yeah, and he somehow outdid Warren Manuel, who allowed Ohio State as the Michigan AD to win a national title in the same year. So, um, reverse kudos to Mr. Cunningham there. Probably as big an insult as I could give him.
All right, Joe. Well, we've got some news now. We have 3 vacancies in the league. We knew about Indiana already. We knew about Minnesota, and it's been known by now that Fran McCaffrey will not be coaching Iowa next year. There were rumors all year that he was going to step down. He put those rumors to bed by saying, "I'm not going anywhere." The AD said, "Yes, you are." So Iowa is going to be hiring a new coach. But first, Joe, there is really not going to be anybody else like Fran McCaffrey, whether it's good or bad.
No, and I think it's bad in terms of entertainment. Fred, you could criticize a lot of his tactics, his
Get
team's lack of defense.
getting ejected in his final game, very on brand. I'm happy for him.
Yeah. Uh, Probably my favorite Fran McCaffrey moment was the stare down 2 years ago at Michigan State when they were down 10 with a minute left and they somehow came back and won that game at home. Um, Fran McCaffrey, for a lot of people are going to make fun of his lack of success in the actual NCAA tournament. I will say the Big Ten tournament run they went on in 2022 was one of the most impressive things I've seen in a conference tournament, especially for a program, let's face it, Sean, who in our lifetime really isn't known for much. The fact he got them a banner and one thing for those fans to look back on, really good players like Luka Garza, Joe Wieskamp, um,
The
and
Murrays.
the Murrays, yeah, and even his own sons, the McCaffreys. So, Brad, I think overall did a pretty good job there. I just think the last, I think his downfall shot was the Richmond game. Let's just call it what it is. After that, I don't think really the fan base thought that they were going to elevate any higher. But he leaves it in a better spot than when he got
Oh, for
there.
sure.
And for anyone really criticizing him, I challenged them to look up Iowa's basketball history after the 90s. And the fact he made them relevant in a Big Ten stage is really good. Probably what they're looking for is a national relevancy, like the women's program. All I have to say for that is good luck.
Yeah, I think, Joe, we're gonna figure out how good Iowa the program is in the next couple years. I think it's probably one of the hardest jobs in the Big Ten. Not the hardest. The hardest is open, I think, also. But, you know, Fran McCaffrey is kind of Iowa basketball. He's there for 15 years. I believe he took over for Steve Alford. Or is there somebody in between?
I believe you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So 15 years, he went 7 for 15. He had a National Player of the Year, multiple players in the NBA, and maybe the style of play wasn't really conducive to tournament success, but he still did win a Big Ten tournament, like you said. So I do think Iowa basketball will be a little bit different in the future. And Joe, there's been nothing more than some rumors here and there, but while there is a definite name for Minnesota, I'm not sure there's a definite name for Iowa here. Who do you think they should be looking at?
DeVries is just the obvious pick, but does he leave West Virginia for 1 year
I think
just
so.
because of you think?
I think he missed the tournament this year, and I think he's going to move up if he can. Now, there's an argument if Iowa's even a step up from West Virginia, but remember he was the coach of Drake, which is in Iowa. I think if offered, I think DeVries would go to Iowa.
Yeah, is it a Ben McCollum whose team's in the tournament? I think that's another. Those are like the two chalk obvious names. One thing I will say, Sean, um, the last coach who did 1 year at like a major at a power conference and then joined the Big Ten was Brad Underwood. So a promising side if you get someone like that, whether that's McCollum or DeVries. But my gut instinct is going to be someone else. Um, I think they're going to look outside the family. And why is the Beth Gates, the athletic director, Beth Getz? This is probably going to be her defining hire, and perhaps she's going to have perhaps this is practice for another defining hire because Kirk Ferentz is not getting any younger. So certainly not. I do not envy her position at all.
Yeah, we after the post on the socials, especially on TikTok, we had a couple Iowa fans, complimenting this and then saying, Coach Ferentz, you're up next. So
Yeah,
could be a busy couple years with some search firms
couple years, couple months for her.
for the Iowa AD. Joe, Minnesota also opened. Ben Johnson fired. We, like, the day before, thought he was okay. They did exceed expectations this year, but at the end of the day, they didn't come through. We already talked about why that was kind of unrealistic, what the AD is expecting. He was on the selection committee. He flew to Minneapolis to tell Ben Johnson to pack up his office. Then he flew back to the selection committee. Now, he didn't fight for Indiana, so I'm going to be a little bit mad with. Maybe he did, and he just didn't hear well. But it is kind of an unwritten rule that the conference ADs do fight for their teams. Apparently, the Temple AD was really instrumental in getting Memphis up to the 5 line, but Minnesota AD has to make a hire, and it seems like this one there's sort of one name that's been targeted so far.
Yeah, Nico Medved, Sean. We saw him kind of Easter eggs of this last year when he came up for the Michigan coaching job, slightly for the Louisville job, but I don't think that was really any. I don't think there was much merit to it. I'll be honest with you, Sean. If Dusty May, let's just say he stays at FAU or goes to Louisville, I have I think it's a more than 50% chance Medved would have been hired at Michigan. I think Michigan really liked him. John Beeline liked him, but I think, Dusty May was the hottest mid-major candidate on the market last year. And the fact that Michigan got him, I think, perhaps this is something Minnesota fans look back on over the years. Medved is a Minnesota native. That I think that's a huge part of it because let's face it, Sean, I don't think many people are taking a huge risk that way. Notably, when Richard Pitino went there in 2013, I think he did it because it was a risk similar to Chris Collins. But Chris Collins went to Northwestern, more on him later, by the way, because he was from Northbrook, Illinois. He grew up in that area. I think you need someone like that. Ben Johnson was a Minnesota Golden Gopher alum. Medved from the area. I think it takes someone like that, Sean, because I don't see someone, for example, at a school like, let's just say, San Diego State, like obviously not Brian Dutcher, but a school like that in the Mountain West. I don't think anyone's necessarily going there without ties.
Yeah, and Medved might not win the press conference, and Michigan fans, I think, would have been a little bit disappointed with him had he been it. But, Joe, I think Minnesota might have to be okay with an okay hire, if that makes sense. Medved's a good basketball coach. He's got Colorado State rolling into the dance again. They made it last year. They've made it a couple times over the years. If you want to win Big Ten championships, you got to hire somebody better, but he should be able to get them in the tournament a couple times. He's had success in the Mountain West, which is obviously a little bit of a top-heavy league, but I don't think it's settling at all for Minnesota to get him, and if it's made, I think that might be the best that they can do.
I think that'd be a really good hire. And if you want a better hire, my suggestion use invent time travel and prevent that snowstorm or that phone call not going through to John Wooden, because that's probably my only advice to you. I don't even say that insulting these Minnesota fans. I just think until the school fan base, alumni base reinvests in that basketball program, keeps really good talent home, and like tries to have some presence around the neighboring states, I think you're going to see more of the same, which is probably ceiling being an NCAA tournament appearance or a win in the NCAA tournament. Something Richard Pitino and, pardon me, Tubby Smith did do.
All right, Joe. Well, the third job that's open is Indiana, officially now. They aren't playing in the postseason. Mike Woodson will be retiring, and the chatter has been awfully silent. There are plenty of Indiana reporters, probably more than maybe just about every team that's not a shade of blue from North Carolina. And, Joe, it's very quiet. There's some rumors here and there. Nothing's really sticking. It's, other than the long shots that didn't hit, there's not really much to go on this Indiana coaching search. And the longer that it goes, I think the more likely it's a wild card. There's a chance that Scott Dolson has identified his guy. He's got a verbal commitment, and as soon as he's eliminated from the NCAA tournament, it's going to be announced. But there's a chance that it's something else, too. So where are you at on the Indiana hire here?
I don't know how similar this was to the Signetti search, but there's no
So
clear.
far, very.
Yeah, there's no clear-cut guy. Um, I have to assume, gun to my head, this guy's in the tournament,
Yeah.
and maybe even more radical than a wild card, Sean. Maybe it's someone we've had no idea That's probably only been floated on a Reddit message board, for an example. Sean, maybe you know something, but you don't?
There's people saying everything. There's
Yeah.
nothing. There's people saying DeVries is a choice, McCollum is a choice, Collins is a choice, Tommy Lloyd is a choice, Cronin. Like, there's probably 8 or 9 names that I wouldn't be surprised with at this point, and I still think it could be outside of those. So, obviously, the decision not to play in the tournament, in the Crown, that is, I think means that the decision is going to be close to, this time next week, Joe, we probably have it, if I had to guess. That would be the team losing one of their first 2 games. The transfer portal opens a week from today, so I know some players have already said they're going to enter and all that. It can't be official until the 24th. Like, they can't be going on visits, and there is a player who's entered with a do not contact tag, but I do think that is a symbol that this might be Tuesday of next week is probably wrapped up,
Yeah.
and the press
Uh,
conference is on BTN.
yeah. Sean, one last thing before we move on to one huge coaching rumor in this conference. Do you think that Indiana has a fallback should someone advance another week? That was a big topic of discussion when Dusty May was hired at Michigan. What if they beat Northwestern, and what if they somehow pulled off a real David and Goliath and beat UConn last year? Do you think that's a possibility that they could wait another week if someone makes the second weekend because it needs to be considered?
I think you can't not hire a coach for a week of the off season, if that makes sense. Yeah, you might miss out on a player in the transfer portal, but Indiana has enough resources where I think if they do have to start behind everybody else, they might be able to catch up in terms of filling the roster with talent. So that really hasn't been the problem over the years. But yeah, I think if it does go another week, Joe, I think we'll know who it is because there's only so many. The smoke will be going up and people will be talking about it, and there's a couple. First of all, 2 of the Indiana coaching candidates are playing each other in the first round, in Clemson and McNeese State. Only one of them can win. So, Will Wade from McNeese is linked with NC State pretty heavily. Reports are that he wants Indiana, but unclear whether Indiana wants him. But I think when it happens, I think we'll know who it is before it's announced, if that makes sense. Woodson was kind of it was rumored that Thad Matta was going to get it. That was retracted, and then later that day was, all right, it is Woodson. So I think that's where we're at right now with it, and I do expect it to be wrapped up next week. But Joe, we have one job that's not in the Big Ten, but 2 Big Ten coaches have been linked with it. One much heavier than the other. The Villanova job is open. They've fired Kyle Neptune, not surprisingly, and it's Northwestern coach Chris Collins who is the primary target right now. It seems like they want him. Kind of seems like he wants them too. And then it was linked today that also Steve Peichel is in the discussions there. So
Wow.
I think it'll be Collins. They said Odom is a primary candidate too, but I think he's going to Virginia. So Chris Collins to Villanova makes kind of sense when you look at it.
I think that'd be a phenomenal hire for both sides. And this is not shade at Northwestern. I think Sean and I were talking off the air yesterday. I think Collins is kind of maxed out at Northwestern. I think there's only so much you can do at a school. Pat Fitzgerald, take out the scandal, I think was always a candidate in these searches because it's pretty well known around the country. Northwestern's, not, although not a major athletic power in football or basketball, they have people like Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner there. They know how hard it is to win there, and to have an appreciation for guys even doing like what's considered middling or somewhat impressive, which for Northwestern has to be scaled up. Not only is it a good school, scaling up with their major athletic teams. So I think Chris Collins is 50 years old. He's been there since 2013. I think this is probably as good a job as he could get. Duke's never going to come open, at least for a very long
The
time.
head coaching job. He could go back there and be assistant, but
Yeah, Duke won't come open. I don't see him taking another Big Ten job. And frankly, if there's a comparable market to an Evanston and the North Shore of Chicago, the northern suburbs of Philadelphia are as close as you can get. People might be a tad meter in the city, but you don't really have to deal with that. And as we know, Villanova and the city of Philadelphia, a weird relationship. So I don't think Collins would even have to go to Philadelphia unless he was getting one of those signature cheesesteaks.
Yeah, and Villanova has sneaky like a lot of resources, and I think Chris Collins with more resources is very interesting, Joe. They've had the good players over the years, and the role players have been the reason why like they haven't been better. Boo Buie was one of the best players in the Big Ten in our lifetimes that we've watched. This year they had Nick Martinelli, Barnheiser, Leach. They had three great players this year. And I think if you have like another million or two in the bank for NIL, I think you fill out that roster better. And I think Chris Collins can get Villanova back into the tournament in year one. Obviously, this isn't a Big East show, but Chris Collins really looks at it. He's never been the head coach anywhere else, I don't think. And he might think to himself, like, hey, this is now a bigger Big Ten with some big brand teams coming in from the West. And while they are in Chicago, Joe, I think this is the hardest job in the Big Ten, Northwestern. I think Iowa
Yeah.
and Minnesota are slightly easier, but before Chris Collins, Joe, at Northwestern were, sort of the bottom team most years.
Yeah, and you had really good coaches there, like Bill Carmody's a very good coach. Failed to make the tournament there. They were consistent NIT contenders, let alone on the bubble of the NCAA tournament. So I think Collins should take that job. If I'm his agent, I'm really encouraging him to take it because let's face it, Sean, barring a North Carolina or Kentucky type job, like a true like bluest of blue bloods, Villanova is probably the next best thing, and
They
I
they
think it's
won
a
two
perfect.
national championships in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's perfect fit. And frankly, I'm not saying he's Jay Wright, so everyone can't clip this and say, "Oh, you're comparing." But I think if there's guys that are like development and role players, I think of Chris Collins, a John Beilein, a Jay Wright, those type of coaches. And I think Chris Collins would be really suited, kind of not necessarily learning from Jay Wright, but having Jay Wright be his special counsel.
And, the Big East is down. And St. John's is rocking right now with Rick Pitino. But, Joe, he's in his 70s. He's not going to be around there forever.
No.
So, UConn, the back-to-back championships down here for them. Like, I think it shouldn't be tough to get them into the tournament in year one. Now, not sure many Villanova fans watch this, but if that ends up being the hire, I think it'll be good for them. But Joe, we got one more thing we want to talk about before we wrap, and it's Iowa star center Owen Freeman entering the transfer portal. Not entirely surprising with his coach leaving. He was the co-Big Ten Freshman of the Year last year. Pretty solid season this year stats-wise before he got injured for the season. But Joe, he has entered the portal with a do not contact tag. Tons of fan bases are claiming that it's because he's coming to their team, but when you do that, you pretty much have your next spot in mind. So what are you hearing when it comes to Owen Freeman?
I'm hearing it's not thinking, sorry. I'm hearing it's between Michigan and Gonzaga. This is from my Michigan sources as well, so certainly could be biased, but the do not contact's a very strong indication. Clearly, he's not been on campus anywhere, or if he has, I mean, it's pretty hard to be
It's a
6'10".
it's a
Well, it's pretty
recruiting
hard to be six.
violation if he has been.
Well, it's pretty hard
Yeah.
to be 6'10", look like him, and not have some kid with a cell phone record you or take a photo. But um, this is a theme we're going to see. Uh, I think some Indiana guys are probably going to enter the portal pretty soon here, Sean. Same with Minnesota. Um, Brock Harding also entered the portal or will enter the portal from Iowa. So kind of a theme we're going to see, but probably Owen Freeman of those guys, certainly right now the most prominent. And looks like he's going to be heading to two teams that won their conference tournament just this week.
If you remember back to last year, Danny Wolf entered the portal with a do not contact tag, and he made it pretty clear early on that he was going to Michigan. So maybe lightning strikes twice for the Wolverines there. But Joe, I think we're going to wrap this one. We've got some other videos to film. So thank you everybody for tuning in to the In a Nutshell podcast. We'll keep throwing in an episode like this, maybe once a week until the college basketball season over, and then football. We'll get back into that when the tournament is over. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.